Hello everybody, this is Gregory of 5 Minute Catholic Apologetics and Living, where 5 minutes of your time will get you to the divine. Today we're going to talk about 5 or 6 topics that you'll probably never hear in a homily if you go to a typical parish. Now before we begin, let's start with a prayer. Nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sic ut era in principio et nunc et semper et saecula saeculorum. Amen. So we do have an episode here on some tips that I give in charity and how priests and deacons can improve their homiletics. Of course, we know only bishops, the clergy, bishops, priests, and deacons should be giving homilies. There shouldn't be lay people. We've seen that liturgical abuse. And I mean, in some ways, I think it's a liturgical abuse when a priest goes up there, gives a 4-minute homily, and then allows a guest speaker to come up there. But topics of homilies. I think most Catholics would say that they forget whatever the homily was talked about within an hour, because most of them, sadly, are not that memorable. And look, I don't necessarily blame the priest, because in the Protestant world, if you're gifted in homiletics or gifted at sermons, then they're like, oh my God, you have a charism. They won't use the word charism, of course, but you have a charism, you go start your church. And so you see a lot of these super mega churches that were started either by a guy or his father, who were those kind of tent house preacher types that are just really good at speaking. But with vocations for the priesthood, it's a vocation, right? It's a calling. And so sometimes, many times in fact, they're not necessarily gifted at homiletics. They're gifted at other things, and God's calling them to be in the clergy. But maybe they're not gifted at homiletics. But this is a separate topic. So yeah, we might have a monotone, lackluster priest or deacon given their homily. But what I'm talking about is, even if you have someone who is an engaging speaker, there's going to be certain topics that you're never going to be heard about in the Mass, in the homily. Now, again, there's going to be exceptions. So I'm talking about, as Father McTeague says, and I always quote him, he used to use the term that he's the host of Catholic Current. He's like this curmudgeon Jesuit. And I was on his show like a year ago, but he uses the term, I don't think he uses it, I think he uses Saint Typicals now, but he used to say Our Lady of Suburbia. But if you're going to Saint Typicals, if you go to the typical suburban Mass for 30 years, you're probably not going to hear homilies on the following. Number 1, and these are no particular order, spiritual warfare. I mean, you're really never going to hear, even if the gospel is on Jesus exorcising a demon, where there be the Gerasene demoniac, or he casts him into the swine who jump off the cliff, or the woman who begs him to get the demon out of her daughter, the one about the scraps from the dog and all this. I mean, there's a lot of examples, not just in the Gospels, but in Acts as well, of demons being taken out. But you're never going to hear, rarely ever, a priest saying, well, daily it's spiritual warfare, angels versus demons. You're not going to hear him really talk about demonic possession, demonic oppression, stay away from witchcraft and Ouija boards and tarot cards and the occult and all the. You're never going to hear about that. It's exceedingly rare. Number 2, cohabiting and fornication. I mean, this one you'll never hear. Exceedingly rare. You know what? The church has always taught that sex is a sacred act that should only be in the confines of marriage. Not to mention the Bible, and we have it here, it talks about 7 times where fornication, and just in the New Testament, is a grave mortal sin that can endanger your chances of getting into heaven. You're not going to hear this. You're not going to hear this. And why is this? Some of this you could see as being maybe pastorally prudent. Because if a priest goes out there and says, fornicating is wrong, and nobody uses the word fornicate. It's like the old Baptist preacher, right? You hear an AM radio, fornicators are hell damned. But if you're cohabiting, it's pretty much understanding is you're having sex. Or if you're just dating, I mean, pretty much the polls show that the Catholics view fornicating and cohabiting on the same level as the secularists, as the non-affiliated. So they don't want to offend the few young people that are St. Typicals, because most of the young people aren't going to Mass. But if there are there, they don't want to offend them. And then they get offended and then never come back. So this is why they just don't even broach the subject, when of course they should be broaching the subject. I mean, spiritual correction is one of the jobs of the clergy, more than it's our job to admonish the sinner and all these things. But that's part of their job, is to preach the truth of Jesus Christ and his church. And one of those things, and in the long run, you're trying to help them, is to tell them, please don't fornicate. Another one you're going to hear about I think, is going to be contraceptives. I can't tell you. I think, I go to a more traditional parish now, but maybe once I've ever heard a priest say, all you women in here, if you're contracepting, you need to stop contracepting. And not just that, but explain the church's teaching on it. Go a little into Humanae Vitae. I mean, you can even go further back into ancient Christianity, like why we were different. We have an episode here on the Catholic Church was really the first feminist organization, and that it actually looked for the rights of women, because in ancient Rome, where Christianity came about, ancient world, ancient Mediterranean basin, women had no rights. They had their first period, they had menarche, boom, you're married off. I don't want to get married. They were married off and many times raped and coerced. They didn't really have choices. But with early Christianity said a higher, nobler thing to do, and Jesus talks about this in Matthew 19, is to essentially be a eunuch, is to not be married. Not to be married. And then Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 2. So women were given an option. It's like, I can be in the consecrated life. I can be a consecrated virgin. Yeah, the ancient Roman world didn't like that. And that's why you see a lot of the early martyrs were young virgins who didn't want to give up their virginity. But either way, you never, ever hear contraceptives talked about. Ever. Or even NFP. Pushing NFP. Post in the comments how you feel about it. NFP can be used in an immoral way if it's used to never have children. But no, just the whole realm of contraceptives is never talked about. So I think these three are big. Fourth one would be homosexual marriage, homosexual marriage. We have an episode here. Homosexual marriage doesn't exist. It does not exist. But I mean, again, this goes back to number 2 when it goes back to cohabiting, and really to a certain extent to contraception too. They don't want to alienate anybody, right? Because the Catholic Church has been labeled by the secular world as being hateful and homophobic. And again, we have an episode here on approaching homosexual marriage. Sorry, that's my dog who just snored. They don't want to come off that way. So I think pastors are worried that if they talk about gay marriage, it's going to reinforce that and alienate not only just if there's any homosexuals in the congregation, but maybe parents or aunts or uncles of homosexuals in that regard. But again, a lot of Catholics don't know why the church teaches these things. Why does the church teach against contraception? Why does the church teach against fornication? Why does the church say that homosexual union is not a union? And so I think pastors, in their prudence, I think they think they're doing the right thing, but I think on one level they're thinking more of the coffers. Because if we alienate enough people, it's going to affect us in the coffers. Also, I think the other thing is that some of these pastors, especially the older ones, believe that the church is wrong on the aforementioned, so why are they going to preach a homily on it? But these 4 things I think you rarely ever hear. Post in the comments if you agree or disagree, and post in the comments as well if there's other topics that you never heard. I didn't mention abortion because I do hear abortion, and to a certain extent all the kind of right to life stuff like euthanasia and embryonic stem cell research and all these things talked about. But post in the comments others that you think I've missed. Until next time, take care, God bless, and pray.